I was having dinner with an old friend the other night, and for the first 20 minutes, really, all he did was vent.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he talked about his boss, the kind who tracks every keystroke, schedules meetings just to hear himself talk.
Ugh, classic.
Exactly. And then his landlord just raised the rent like 15%.
Yeah.
For an apartment that still has the same leaky faucet from 2 years ago.
Of course.
He was just exhausted, cynical, felt completely trapped. And he looked at me across the table and just said, "This whole system is broken, isn't it?"
Mm-hmm.
And, well, he was right. So I decided to push it a little. I asked him, well, what if we just, got rid of it? What if there were no bosses? What if housing wasn't something you had to rent?
Okay, interesting approach. How'd that go down?
Well, I expected him to be curious, maybe even relieved at the thought, but that's not what happened at all. His whole posture changed. Sat up straight, got this defensive look.
The snapback.
Immediately started listing objections. That's just impossible, he said. It would be total chaos. Who would make sure people actually did their jobs? Who would own the buildings? It was fascinating. 1 minute, he's cursing the cell walls. The next, you offer him the key, and suddenly he's defending the prison architecture.
Yeah, that immediate, almost fearful defense of the structure, even when you know it's faulty. It's so common.
It really is. It feels like the biggest wall we face, not the one outside, but the one in our own minds. And it makes you wonder, right? If we all agree the house is on fire, why are we so terrified to even imagine living somewhere else?
That phenomena, the immediate snap back to defending the status quo, it really is the core obstacle, isn't it?
Yeah.
We've sort of been conditioned, I think, to believe that these punitive systems, strict boundaries, hierarchy, that they're the only things preventing total collapse.
Right.
But when you actually examine the data, look closely at the policies, that fear starts to look less like wisdom and more like, well, institutional conditioning. So our deep dive today is really dedicated to moving past that cynicism. We're going to look at specific evidence-based blueprints for a different kind of society.
Okay.
Our mission, really, is to analyze 3 major areas of this kind of systemic control, you could call them cages, borders, and bosses, and look at the concrete policy proposals, the ones that could effectively dismantle them, and, crucially, build functional, equitable alternatives.
So we're talking detailed policy proposals here, things like sentencing reform aiming to cut the federal prison population by, what, nearly 80%?
Exactly. And organizational models for democratizing the economy. We'll examine the strategies for phasing out traditional prisons for community-based restorative justice.
And assessing new governance models for global resources, human movement.
Yes, and investigating the design principles for scaling up cooperative businesses. It's about mapping that path, from what's clearly broken to what might actually be possible.
Okay, let's start with the first one then, cages, the prison system.
All right, let's start with the system of cages,
right?
Mass incarceration.
Yeah. And
the scale, it's just impossible to ignore, especially when you look at the sheer duration of punishment.
Yeah.
By 2019, more than half, 57% of the U.S. prison population was serving a sentence of 10 years or more.
Wow, 57%.
Yeah. These aren't short-term things. These are life-altering, decades-long removals from society.
And I read something about life sentences that was just staggering.
Go on.
As of 2020, 1 in 7 people in U.S. prisons was serving a life sentence. That's what was the number. 203,865 people.
Yeah, it's huge.
And here's the kicker. That number, just the people serving life sentences now, is larger than the entire incarcerated population of the U.S. back in 1970.
That historical comparison is vital. It proves this level of punitive confinement isn't some inevitable thing. It's the direct result of policy choices made over the last 50 years.
Right.
And what's this massive, expensive structure built on? Ostensibly, 4 traditional pillars of sentencing: retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation.
The classic.
We rely on these concepts. They're central to policy, yet the actual evidence for their success is, well, paltry. And the evidence for the harm they cause, overwhelming.
So how does that failure actually, play out? Retribution is supposed to be about moral balance, right?
Supposedly. But it often fails completely to address the actual harm the victim suffered or the root causes of why the offense happened in the first place.
And deterrence, the idea that long sentences scare people straight.
The data just doesn't back it up. Decades of handing out longer and longer sentences haven't correlated with significantly lower crime rates in the way the theory predicts.
Okay, and incapacitation, locking someone up so they can't commit more crimes.
That one collapses when you look at basic human development.
Yeah.
The research is absolutely definitive on this. People age out of violent crime.
Right, I've heard that.
Arrest rates for something like murder dropped by 65% by the mid-30s compared to the late teens or early 20s. For robbery, it's an 80% drop.
80%.
So giving someone who was convicted at 20 a 40-year sentence based on their risk profile at 20, it just ignores the science. It ignores reality.
And the cost of the system, it isn't borne equally, is it?
Not even close. Black and Latino communities make up 58% of the U.S. prison population, but only about 31% of the overall population.
That's a huge disparity.
It's not a coincidence. It's arguably the intended outcome of centuries of discriminatory policy. In the federal system, for example, black men receive sentences that are, on average, 19.1% longer than white men.
Even for the same crime.
Even when you control for conviction history and the severity of the offense, the disparity is built in.
So to understand how we got here, we need to look at the history, the tough on crime stuff.
Exactly, and through a racial lens. Go all the way back to the colonial era. You see the creation of slave code legislation. These explicitly created harsh, separate punishments based on race. They were the intellectual forerunners of Jim Crow laws. Then after the Civil War, you had things like indeterminate sentences in the North parole-based release, which often meant long sentences decided by a parole board's whim. But in the South, they immediately passed the black codes.
Right, the vagrancy laws, things like that.
Precisely. Vague, often absurd laws criminalizing everyday behavior, effectively allowing police to re-enslave black men through the convict leasing system. By the 1870s, 95% of incarcerated people in the South were black.
95%.
Then jump forward to the 1970s. The rhetoric shifts to the war on drugs. This is where mandatory minimums really take off.
Like the crack versus powder cocaine disparity.
The classic example, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of '88, a 5-year minimum sentence for possessing just 5 grams of crack cocaine compared to 500 grams of powder cocaine to get the same sentence. That 100-to-1 ratio.
Which was later reduced, but still.
So hugely disproportionate. Is race neutral on paper, maybe, but structurally targeted black communities.
And that era also gave us 3 strikes laws.
Yeah, mandating severe sentences, often 25 to life, for repeat offenses, even if the third strike was relatively minor.
And these laws, combined with mandatory minimums, they gave prosecutors enormous power, didn't they?
Incredible leverage in plea bargaining. Prosecutors could threaten these potentially catastrophic life sentences, forcing people to accept long pleas just to avoid the risk. That's a key mechanism that drove those life without parole numbers sky high.
So ultimately, this whole architecture, it fails even on its own terms, the public safety argument.
Completely. Incarceration breeds disruption and trauma. It strips neighborhoods of vital residents, parents, caregivers, breadwinners, destabilizing the whole community fabric.
Right.
And that massive 2021 meta-analysis you mentioned earlier, looking at 116 studies, it proved that custodial sentences don't just fail to prevent reoffending.
They can actually increase it.
Exactly. The system doesn't deliver safety. In many ways, it actively undermines the foundation of the communities it claims to protect.
Okay, so if the current system is biased, ineffective, maybe even counterproductive, the solution has to be a fundamental redesign.
Yeah.
You mentioned this North Star approach, centering liberty, safety, and repair. What does that mean legally?
It means resetting the default setting, essentially.
Yeah.
We have to recognize liberty as a fundamental right. It should only be constrained for a truly compelling purpose, and even then, only using the least restrictive means. That's a legal principle called parsimony.
Least restrictive means.
So the North Star approach requires a court to use incarceration only as a limited exception. There should be a strong presumption towards liberty, overcome only by clear and convincing evidence that safety or repair absolutely justifies confinement.
That's a big philosophical shift. How do we translate that into specific policies that actually, empty cages and redirect resources? You mentioned 7 legislative proposals. Let's maybe dig into those, starting with the one with the biggest modeled impact.
Okay, that would be setting maximum prison sentences. The proposal is simple but profound. Put a cap on prison terms for even the most serious felonies, say 20 years for adults.
20 years max.
And crucially, cap it at 15 years for young people up to age 25.
Why the distinction for younger people?
Because it directly addresses the evidence we just talked about, the reduced culpability and the high potential for growth and change in younger individuals. You're aligning the law with developmental science.
Makes sense. And the impact of just that one change.
The modeling suggests sentencing caps alone would lead to a 32% reduction in the federal prison population over 10 years.
32%. That's huge, just from ending sentences that outlast a person's high-risk years.
It's a massive immediate step. Next up, good time reform. This changes the incentive structure inside the prison walls.
How so?
Instead of relying mostly on negative control, punishment for breaking rules, this reform sets up a system where a person can earn 1 day off their sentence for every day of positive behavior and compliance.
So it's earned, not automatic.
Exactly. It's a structural tool to encourage growth, participation, compliance. It gives people an immediate daily stake in their own progress and behavior.
Less about punitive surveillance, more about incentivizing positive engagement. What kind of reduction are we talking about there?
The models assume this could reduce sentences by about 41% for the vast majority, like 82% of incarcerated people who would likely earn that credit.
Okay, number 3 targets racial bias directly.
Yes. Removing extensions based on prior convictions, these prior record enhancements are a major driver of racial disparities.
Why specifically?
Because due to factors like over-policing, biased stop-and-frisk practices, unfair conviction patterns, Black and Latino people are statistically more likely to have prior conviction histories in the first place.
Right, so using those histories to drastically increase a new sentence just creates this feedback loop of inequality.
Precisely. The source material mentioned data from Minnesota showing Black defendants were 50% more likely to get prison than white defendants, and over half of that gap was due to these criminal history scores. Deleting these enhancements is crucial to break that cycle.
Makes sense. 4th proposal.
Abolish mandatory minimums. We talked about how these came from the flawed deterrence theories of the 70s and 80s.
Right, and how they empower prosecutors.
That's their main function today. Threaten a decades-long mandatory minimum, force a harsh plea bargain, bypass judicial discretion entirely. Abolishing them restores flexibility, lets judges consider individual circumstances, and crucially prioritize repair over just punishment.
Got it. So number 5 is about alternatives.
Expand community-based sentencing. This basically says, look, any conviction, regardless of severity, has to be considered for a community-based sentence first, including things like intensive restorative justice programs.
So challenging that automatic assumption, felony equals prison time.
Exactly. Challenging the default. 6th is the second-link sentencing review. This acknowledges that people change over time.
How does that work?
It creates a formal mechanism. People serving extremely lengthy sentences, say, after 10 or 15 years, can petition the court for resentencing. This is vital for reversing those excessive incapacitation sentences given to people convicted in their youth, like the law in D.C., for those convicted before age 25.
So the system can finally account for maturation, rehabilitation, genuine change.
Instead of locking in a decision made decades ago based on who someone was then. And finally, number 7 is purely preventative. Mandate racial impact assessments.
Meaning?
Requiring legislatures to formally assess the potential impact of any new crime-related bill on racial disparities before it becomes law. It's a way to stop digging the hole deeper, basically.
Okay, so if you put these pieces together, the modeling showed a potential 80% reduction.
Implementing 5 of these proposals, the sentencing caps, good time reform, eliminating prior record enhancements, abolishing mandatory minimums, and expanding community options modeling suggests it could reduce the federal prison population by close to 80%, down from around 150,000 to roughly 30,000 people.
That's practically abolition, achieved through smart legislative design, not just rhetoric.
It's transformative. But of course, a plan to free 80% of the prison population can't exist in a vacuum.
Right. You need a massive shift towards building safety differently, rooted in community health, not just enforcement.
Exactly. And that repair component of the North Star model is critical here, focusing on restorative justice.
Which shifts the focus from the state versus the offender to the actual victim and the community, right? Emphasizing things like listening, apology, restitution, service.
Yes, actions aimed at actually repairing the harm caused. But, as you hinted, restorative practices are often, mistakenly, reserved only for minor, nonviolent offenses.
Yeah, that seems to be the common practice.
And it's exactly contrary to the evidence. A major 2019 meta-analysis of restorative justice programs found participants were 41.5% less likely to be rearrested than those sentenced traditionally.
Less likely.
And crucially, those harm-reducing effects were actually more consistent when applied to serious or repeat offenses.
Really? More consistent for serious offenses?
Yes. which strongly suggests we should be broadening its application dramatically, even including things like community service, but reconceived not as just picking up trash, but as actions tied closely to community needs and using the person's actual skills.
Okay, so as decarceration happens, you're left with these physical buildings, the prisons themselves. We need to talk about repurposing closed carceral facilities. You said 21 states closed prisons between 2000 and 2022. What happens to them?
Well, the repurposing examples are quite powerful, symbolically and economically. Think of Arthur Kill Correctional Facility in New York. Huge 69-acre site on the waterfront.
What is it now?
It's now Sound Stages, an elite film and TV production facility, generating over 1,300 local jobs.
What?
Or Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary in Tennessee, turned into a whiskey distillery and tourist attraction. In Dallas, the Dawson State Jail was bought by the city for park development. It's about repurposing the land and the investment towards community value.
So it's not just a physical change, it's a financial shift, this idea of community reinvestment.
Exactly. Redirecting the billions of dollars previously spent on operating prisons back into those marginalized high incarceration neighborhoods, investing directly in things that build social capital quality schools, community health centers, youth programs, affordable housing.
Basically investing in the stability that the carceral system actively destroyed by removing so many people.
Precisely. And there's a unique, though time-limited financial tool available right now. The American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA Fiscal Recovery Fund.
Ah, the COVID relief funds.
Yeah, states and localities got significant federal cash that can be used for non-carceral public safety investments. This is like a blueprint right now for how a city can immediately start building a system based on community wellness rather than just policing and prisons.
Okay, let's break that down. Where can those funds actually go, based on evidence of what truly reduces crime? First up, housing and infrastructure.
Right. Studies clearly show building affordable housing demonstrably reduces violent crime. Urban greening, like Philadelphia's Green Stormwater Infrastructure Program, led to significant drops in local arrests for drug possession and burglaries.
Greening spaces reduces arrests. That's interesting.
Yeah, environmental design matters. Even something as simple as installing better streetlights was shown to reduce major index crimes in New York City by more than a third. These are tangible changes that foster safety.
Okay, what else?
Then there's the huge impact of direct financial assistance. Economic inequality, as the source material points out, predicts homicide rates better than almost any other single variable.
Wow, better than anything else.
When you decrease unemployment, property crime falls. When you provide emergency financial help to people in crisis, total arrests go down. One study found a 51% reduction in arrests for violent crimes. Guaranteed income pilots, like Boston's fund for formerly incarcerated women, are direct investments in stability.
And finally, health investments.
Absolutely crucial. Medicaid expansion, for instance, has been shown to reduce crime by about 3% annually. Why? Mainly because it increases access to substance use disorder treatment, addressing a major root cause of crime.
And mental health treatment.
Same logic. Expanded access to psychiatric treatment reduces violent crime rates. And these health investments directly support the expansion of non-carceral crisis response.
Right, instead of sending police to mental health calls.
Exactly. Models like Denver's STAR program or Mental Health First in Sacramento use trained non-police responders, mental health professionals, paramedics, community mediators for behavioral health crises, some domestic violence situations.
Providing a de-escalatory alternative.
A safe alternative that removes the inherent risk of escalation that comes with introducing law enforcement into sensitive situations. It's shifting from crisis management via force to crisis resolution via care.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about domestic systems of enclosure, the cages managing people internally, but this logic, this philosophy of punitive enclosure and control, it extends globally, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
Correct.
The logic of the cage doesn't stop at the prison wall, it extends right to the border wall.
Let's transition there then, challenging borders.
When we look at global enclosure, we have to apply that same critical lens. The core argument of border abolition isn't that borders don't exist, but that immigration controls don't actually prevent movement or protect citizens in the way they claim. Instead, they often produce the very harms they supposedly prevent: loss of life, exploitation, inequality.
So, similar to prison abolition, it's framed as an internationalist, anti-capitalist kind of politics.
Exactly. It's about dismantling structures that manage undesirable populations through forced immobilization or exile, and trying to cultivate new forms of global connection and community. The goal isn't chaos, it's expanding that fundamental human right to freedom. The freedom to move, yes, but also the freedom to stay safely.
And there's a deep link between border controls and economic hierarchy, right? The bosses aspect.
Intrinsically linked. This brings us to immigration controls and exploitation. Border controls fundamentally strengthen the power of employers, of bosses.
How so?
They make migrant workers, especially undocumented ones, incredibly pliable and exploitable. The constant terrifying threat of detention and deportation hangs over them.
Which makes them less likely to complain about wages or conditions?
Or even ask for basic rights. We saw this starkly in that 2016 Byron Burgers raid in the UK. 35 migrant workers were basically entrapped and deported with the help of their employer. The state's border apparatus becomes a tool of labor discipline for the boss.
And even for documented workers, if their visa is tied to their employer.
They're trapped. Lose the job, lose your status, face deportation. How can you realistically ask for a raise, report unsafe conditions, or push back against excessive hours when your entire life in that country is on the line? You simply can't assert your labor rights effectively.
So that structural vulnerability, that's what undermines wages, not just the presence of migrants. It's the system making them unable to demand fair pay.
Precisely, which dismantles that common, often xenophobic argument.
Yeah.
And it leads directly to the necessity of worker solidarity.
Meaning solidarity between native-born and migrant workers.
Absolutely. Better working conditions, higher wages for everyone depend entirely on the capacity for collective resistance among all workers. When immigration controls weaken the power of one group through fear and precarity, they weaken the collective bargaining power of the entire workforce.
So labor unions have a critical role here. You mentioned non-reformist reforms.
Yeah, these are changes that don't just tweak the system, but actually challenge its underlying logic of control. Unions should be pushing hard to ensure everyone can access labor rights, regardless of immigration status.
What would that look like?
Campaigning to abolish workplace immigration checks, abolishing the very crime of illegal working, fighting back against immigration raids at workplaces. These actions shift the power balance away from employers who exploit vulnerability and back towards the collective workforce.
Okay, and this ties into a critique of global inequality and development aid.
Yes, finally, we have to challenge this myth of development and containment. Border abolition is inherently internationalist because it has to confront the vast global inequalities and ongoing economic extraction that often drive migration in the first place.
The narrative we usually hear is that rich countries help poorer countries develop so people won't need to leave.
Right, the build capacity argument.
Yeah.
But the reality, when you look at the policies, is often far more cynical. Contemporary development politics are frequently framed by a logic of scarcity, too many people, not enough resources, and the overriding impulse becomes containing the global poor in those places of perceived scarcity.
Can you give an example?
The European Union Trust Fund for Africa, the EUTF, is a textbook case. It funnels funds to African states, but that funding is often conditioned on their compliance with EU border control efforts.
So aid in exchange for acting as Europe's border guards.
Essentially, yes. It often takes the form of capacity-building initiatives, funding, training, technology that modernize police and surveillance systems in African nations, specifically designed to immobilize unruly populations, as the source material put it. They're investing in controlling movement, not necessarily alleviating the reasons for it.
And this happens even though poverty itself isn't always the main driver of migration.
Exactly. It often ignores factors like political instability, climate change, historical exploitation. The goal of much of this policy isn't really development or poverty reduction, it's containment. It's the externalization of border control. The border becomes a tool for the global north to manage and enforce global inequality.
So if the border is the global tool for enforcing inequality and maintaining that pliable labor pool, then the final structure we need to tackle is the internal hierarchy that dictates who profits from that labor, the system of bosses.
Precisely. The final structure to challenge is that traditional hierarchy of the workplace. And the proposed alternative we're looking at is the worker cooperative model.
Where workers are the owners, not just employees.
Exactly. Now, it's still a pretty niche sector in the U.S., maybe 300 to 400 co-ops currently identified.
Yeah.
But the organizational structure itself seems to yield significantly better economic outcomes.
Better outcomes how?
Well, the data shows worker co-ops generally provide better paying jobs. They boast much lower employee turnover. Cooperative home care associates was mentioned, with just 15% annual turnover compared to industry norms of 40, even 60%.
Wow, that's a huge difference in stability.
It is. And they also report higher productivity levels, somewhere between 9 and 19% higher than traditionally structured businesses in the same sector.
And that translates to the bottom line.
It seems to. Lower turnover, higher productivity often lead to increased profitability and significantly greater longevity. Employee-owned enterprises are about 1/3 as likely to fail as publicly traded companies.
1/3 is likely to fail.
Yeah, it suggests that democratic ownership, that shared risk and reward, actually creates a more resilient, more sustainable business model. It really challenges that old idea that you need top-down hierarchy for efficiency.
Okay, so the model works well on a small scale. You said 71% have fewer than 15 members. The big challenge then is scaling the model, right? How do you go bigger?
That's the key question. The sources highlight two main successful strategies for scaling that have been tried. First is single industry replication.
Like a franchise, but cooperative.
Sort of. Like the Arizmendi Bakery Pizzeria's model, where you replicate a successful co-op model across multiple locations within the same industry.
Okay, and the second strategy?
This one has huge potential for community wealth building. The place-based cluster model. This involves developing several co-ops, often in diverse industries, but all within a specific geographical area. And critically, often leveraging local anchor institutions.
Anchor institutions like hospitals, universities.
Exactly. The prime example discussed is the Evergreen Cooperative Initiative in Cleveland. They had this brilliant insight. These big anchors, hospitals, universities, large nonprofits have enormous stable economic power just through their regular purchasing, their procurement streams.
Laundry, food services, energy.
All of it. So Evergreen works to link those anchor procurement contracts directly to newly created worker co-ops. Co-ops that are locally owned by residents of seriously distressed neighborhoods nearby. They start with an industrial laundry, an energy efficiency company, a large urban greenhouse.
So it creates a kind of circular economy. The anchor's money stays local, builds jobs and wealth right there.
That's the explicit goal. Stabilize these neighborhoods by creating living wage jobs that build actual wealth for the residents. It fundamentally changes who profits and ensures the economic activity generated by the city's largest institutions benefits the local community directly.
It sounds incredibly promising, but scaling always faces barriers to growth. What are the main ones for co-ops?
Well, beyond a general cultural emphasis on individualism that can sometimes run counter to collaborative ownership, a really critical barrier is the lack of specialized support infrastructure. And perhaps most importantly, the lack of large-scale patient capital.
Patient capital, what exactly does that mean?
It's capital that is willing to wait for long-term returns, rather than demanding rapid, high profits and a quick exit. Traditional banking and venture capital are often fundamentally extractive in their logic. They prioritize maximizing short-term shareholder value.
Which is basically the opposite of a co-op's goal, which is more about long-term stability and democratic member benefit.
Exactly. That traditional finance structure is often antithetical to the slow, stable, democratic growth model of a co-op. So the data shows that co-ops founded with member financing, or grants the most patient kinds of capital, have the greatest longevity by far.
So the U.S. essentially lacks the financial ecosystem needed to fund large-scale co-op development.
Largely, yes. What's missing is something like the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation's bank in Spain, La Caixa Laboral. It was specifically established to provide that patient financing and co-op development expertise tailored to support long-term democratic ownership.
So success needs more than just a good idea. It needs that supportive ecosystem.
It needs ongoing training, cultivating that collaborative culture, absolutely. It needs strong management skilled business people who can work effectively in a participatory way. But fundamentally, it needs access to capital that understands and supports the long-term community building mission, not just short-term profit extraction. You know, when you synthesize these different movements we've explored today, whether it's challenging the carceral state's control over liberty, or the border system's control over movement, or workplace hierarchies' control over economic dignity, a really clear central thread emerges, I think.
Yeah.
These are all systemic challenges aimed at reclaiming fundamental human rights: liberty, dignity, movement, self-determination. And doing so by fundamentally changing these deeply entrenched structures of power and control.
And these deep dives into the actual policy, the organizational design, they really reveal that these visions of radical change aren't just, utopian fantasies. We've looked at detailed, evidence-based blueprints. achieving an 80% reduction in the federal prison population through specific legislative fixes, rerouting federal funds like ARPA to build real community wellness infrastructure, strengthening international labor power through concrete union strategies, democratizing capital and industry through scalable worker cooperatives. These aren't just abstract ideas, they're tangible models for system transformation, models that are already being tested in various ways. And ultimately, their success relies on political will and smart organizational design, not waiting for some kind of miracle.